All right, here's the Western civilization talk through. These are some people who were cornerstones of Western civilization. The question of where is the West was interesting because Australia is somehow the West. This is a map of different cultures from a book called The Clash of Civilizations. Sam Huntington thought that there was a war of ideology because he had seen one between Russia, the USSR during the Cold War, and the West with the United States and Russia as the two nuclear powers. And he saw the war of ideology kind of shifting to the West versus Islam. And he thought that there was going to be another clash of civilizations. People like violence, so a lot of people bought that book. Western civilization is ancient Greek philosophy, Roman political thought, and Abrahamic religions, which means Islam, Judaism, and Christianity. Contemporary Western civilization has no respect for authority, which means no extra respect for authority. Everybody believes in equality, but in addition to believing that everybody is equal, they also believe in meritocracy. Meritocracy being ruled by the talented and intelligent. So the new rules are meritocracy, scientific materialism, which is like this world, what you see is what you get. If I can measure something and then show you again, that means it's true. And transparency, which means you can see we don't have secret shadow governments. Instead, we have a government doing business out in the open. Western psychology does not have the caste system, which comes from India, where you have the Brahmins, Kshatriya, Vaishya, Sudra, and untouchables, and it's all written in. People are born into a situation that they're going to probably die in, and Westerners do not believe in that. We think that somebody could be born to a housemaid or a laborer and become the president. This is something that I haven't seen happen, but Westerners like to believe in this. Equality is very important. We are very ashamed of the way in which we have treated people poorly, and we are very proud of the things that we have done to make that go away, to bring about more equality. And you see now I'm using the word we. Okay. So, black men got the vote, women got it afterwards. Feminists are fond of reminding us this. Minimum wage, I looked this up in class. It's something like $15 an hour. You can look at what that is. I think we determined that $15 an hour, 40 hours a week, and you know that the laborers here work way more than 40 hours a week. $15 an hour, 40 hours a week is something like 80,000 baht per month. It might even be more than that. But San Francisco is, of course, the most expensive city in the United States. Okay, so Western psychology does not have the caste system. It does not have samsara. It does not have anatta. Samsara is, of course, the continual rebirth and death and rebirth and death and rebirth and death. And the Christian soul is going somewhere. Anatta, you know what that is. No self. The Western self is very important. Individuality is very important. Okay, Westerners are weird. This is the point of this is that Western psychology is focused almost entirely on American undergraduates. Remember that? Okay, this is what the rest of the course is. We won't talk about this. Okay. Yeah, I'll give you that. So there's a narrative of Western civilization that basically goes ancient Greece and then the re-enlightenment. In the middle, Rome gave us order, which is like our current relationship to technology. We are further ahead of natural problems, yet still disconnected. Christianity's dominion of the West is viewed negatively by a lot of atheists are the majority in universities and scientific positions, and in the government people will be split. Half are Christian, half are not. We have famously never had a president who does not claim to be Christian. They're all saying that. But I'm very happy that you had Ajahn Rit give you a good, positive view of Christianity. Prehistory is usually ignored, and that's why it's awesome that Ajahn Thanapon gave you a lot of ancient civilizations about which we know very little. They're very mysterious, and what we get mostly is their mythologies. We don't get a lot of their hardcore doctrines, and Westerners are very into hardcore doctrines. Not that we are afraid of mythology. We like mythology quite a bit. It's more fun. I gave you the boring things. So here's more of the boring things. The re-enlightenment is the way we look at it a lot of times. It's like we find ourselves in ancient Greece again. Science helped us escape from Christianity. That's the way that it usually gets framed. And we mastered nature. Systems of government such as democracy, capitalism, socialism, and communism. We study revolutions a little bit. We study colonialism, and remember that it used to be seen as a good thing until about 1950, 1960, and then it was always seen as a bad thing. We look at the rise of human rights, and this is something that's very central to what Westerners believe. Westerners think human rights are very important. Globalization, and with it comes ethical relativism, which means your culture, my culture, you see things differently. There's no universal right and wrong. There's just people seeing things differently. Eurocentric and patriarchal. These words get thrown at the way that the West dominates the world, but many cultures tend to be patriarchal. Eurocentric means Westerners in particular, because Westerners would be people of European descent and people who grow up in a culture that's dominated by the culture that came from Europe. My training personally, recently, I've been studying a lot of psychology. Before that, I was taking a PhD program in religion. Philosophy is the study of thought. That is my first master's degree, and literature is my second master's degree. That's the study of stories. Lots of words. Western civilization is here, and I would like you to accept the parts that you like and get rid of the parts that you don't like. It's up to you. That's a very Western idea, I think. Some of my slides are not going to look perfect, but bear with me. I haven't done this screencasting before. Rome. I'm going to go through this actually very quickly because we spent a lot of time on Rome, and I want to prepare you to take the test. Romans are famous for aqueducts, water bridges, regular bridges, still in place in Europe in many places. Gladiators, who were slaves who fight each other in the Colosseum. This stands for the Senatus Populesque Romanus, the Senate and the people of Rome. My note says that Greeks did city-states, Romans built an empire, and cities did very well. Running water, better than Paris or Chicago in 1920, but tuberculosis could still kill somebody in their 20s. So life was short. You want to be very ambitious and live as fast as you can. So these are some of the early conquests. This is what Rome looked like. Roman classes. The patricians had clients. They were the elite noblemen. The equestrians were like a middle class, and that means kind of like a knight. Equestrian involves horses. So they were like horse riding knights. They were like a middle class, a business class. The plebeians, referred to as the plebs, were represented in the Senate by the tribune. The tribune was their person who could say no to the Senates. There were also non-citizens and slaves. The government contained consuls, 2 of them at a time, who served for a year at a time, and they were also military leaders. The Senate was composed of the noblemen, and they had the majority of the power, and they sat in the Senate for long periods of time. It wasn't just a power thing, it was also a prestige thing. They owned a lot of the land. The tribune was the representative of the common people, and the tribune could say no to the Senate, and did sometimes, and got killed for it sometimes. The personality of Rome was very patriotic, ambitious. There was a lot of offense and defense going on constantly. People were trying to advance their positions all the time. Dan Carlin, my favorite historian, who calls himself a fan of history, not a historian, but I recommend his stuff very much. He's fun to listen to for hours. He described it as a giant king of the mountain game. Here's the comparison to the United States. Now, the U.S. spends more on military right now. This is comparison to the U.S. right now, obviously, than the next 6 or 7 countries, depending on the year. The military-industrial complex is kind of a machine that you hear. This term has been around since the World Wars, and it's about how war has become mechanized and war has become a thing where you need a home front. You need companies that are producing these products of war. They need to be producing not just the bullets and the artillery shells. They need to be producing all of these tanks and giant guns and everything. And if you are an industrialized nation and you fight a war, you have a ton of upakon. And if you have good upakon, you don't need a lot of people. The United States is unquestionably the most powerful military in the world, but the Chinese army has more people. It's just that we have the heart of the military-industrial complex. We have all of the arms dealers in our country. They make the best military toys for now. Rome was similar because the war machine in Rome was based on the fact that a military command, like a consulship, was a temporary job. Rome gave you an army, and you have to go use it. Caesar, for instance, was supposed to go up north, and he had an army. He wasn't trying to keep the peace. He was trying to go up there, kill a lot of people, turn a lot of people into slaves, and sell those slaves for money. So Roman diplomacy looked a lot like this. There was a lot of "this is Sparta" going on, where messengers would be kicked down holes. Not literally, but it was true that the Roman generals were not trying to make peace. They wanted war because they profited off of war, and they typically won. They typically won by a lot. So if the United States acted like Rome right now, they'd be trying to take over the world in an overt fashion where the American flag would fly over everywhere. But we've kind of moved out of that paradigm. When a Roman general would return home, they would have something called a triumph, which is where they ride in on an elephant and they look awesome. Everybody looks at them. It's very much an Instagram-able moment. But not all Romans were satisfied by just having a triumph. So we're going to talk about the fall of the Roman Empire, the decline of the Western Roman Republic, because remember, the Eastern Roman Empire lasted for a long time, and then it was called Byzantium, was based on a few things. There were too many wars. There were not enough soldiers because soldiers had to own land. There were not enough citizens, and soldiers were needed to be citizens. And there was tremendous economic inequality, which means the rich were very, very rich and owned almost all of the land. The poor were very, very poor. They were too poor to be citizens, soldiers. And there were a lot of slaves, and the slaves were free labor, and free labor is much less expensive than cheap labor. So your economy kind of gets tied up when those problems happen. This slide is about that right there. If you have free labor, you're not going to use cheap labor. And so a lot of people didn't have jobs. There's nobody to buy the products. You can see where that goes. There are short-term benefits to slavery and long-term problems. There are a lot of arguments today that the reason we have moved past slavery is not because we are good, but because slavery is not economically viable. It's not a good system for the slave owners either, because a slave will only work hard enough to not be beaten. And you don't want somebody motivated that way. You want somebody who's motivated by the possibility that they could have a better situation. That's a better worker. And that's what these people think. Other people think just slavery is wrong and we want to get rid of that. Okay, so why did it happen? Lots of politics, lots of corruption in the politics, and lots of violence in the corrupt politics. Caesar was one of the first to come back and ride into town with an army and make his political will happen that way. And this was seen by most of the historians who look at it as something that Rome couldn't go back from, because once one consul rides into Rome with an army, it's so much easier for the next consul to say, well, that's just how we do things here, because it's not a sacred space. Caesar, furthermore, was murdered on the Senate floor by senators carrying daggers, many of them stabbing him to death. So there's a lot of tremendously violent stuff happening in politics, and even in the houses of politics, because Caesar was murdered on the steps of the Senate. Free labor, cheap labor, you remember that. Roman law said that there were limitations on the property that one person could own, and this law was not being enforced. So there were solutions that Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus, who were tribunes of the people, they came up with a lot of solutions. The Senate, who owned all the land, hated them and wanted to destroy them. And the Gracchus brothers, in the process, they sort of tried to build up this middle class. We called them before the Equestrian Class. They were like the business class, knights. And a lot of them became very powerful. In the process, a lot of people say that Rome started to do well, and this was a good thing. But the senators, even if they would have been sympathetic to this, the fact that these brothers were fighting against them and they were correct messed with their sense of honor, because everybody is very ambitious. So these guys, a lot of people compare them to the Kennedys and say they were a bunch of bleeding heart liberals. Others say that they were demagogues and they were trying to give the people what they wanted in order to gain power for themselves. Both of them, of course, were murdered. They became quite influential and quite powerful because they were very talented, and they were, like I said, trying to give the people what they wanted. Tiberius Gracchus, in particular, he tried to give all the wealth from Pergamum, which is a recently conquered territory, that the king of Pergamum said, I leave all of my money to Rome, and Rome can do whatever they want with it. He wanted to use all of that wealth in order to feed the poor people and take care of a lot of people. He was also talking about giving citizenship to Italians who were not Romans, and the Senate beat him to death with table legs. Pretty metal. So here's the death of a Gracchus brother. A lot of people wonder if Tiberius Gracchus was a demagogue. I'm just like this. One of the ways that the Gracchus brothers empowered the equestrian class, the middle class, was they gave them the ability to be tax collectors. And another thing that they would do is oversee mining operations, like in Spain. And the thing that was so crazy was that mining, on the level that they were doing it, and they were of course doing it with slaves, because mining is horrible work. They wouldn't do it on this level until the Industrial Revolution, which was, quite recently, like a couple 100 years ago. So you can see this picture. It's obviously not from Rome because photography didn't exist back then. So the business class, through being tax collectors and through being these people who would oversee operations like mining operations, they started to become powerful enough to call shots and say, hey, there's a beautiful place in North Africa where I would like to do some business. If only you could go over there with your army and whack those people and make that Rome. I could do some good Roman business over there. And a lot of times that happened. Numidia, North Africa, which is near Carthage, their ancient empire, ancient enemy, was one of these places. And they got into a very serious war, very similar to the American war in Afghanistan, where they're fighting against guerrilla warriors in a ton of desert mountain chains, which is where you have a valley, mountain. It's very hard to find everybody, and they can just go back up there because they know the land very well. They can go back up there and hide in caves. They're not fighting this great Roman army in the field. And so Numidia became a place where they wanted to do some business, but they got into some serious trouble. Here's another legend. Gaius Marius. I don't have direct questions about him, but you're welcome to write about him. He fought in the Punic Wars against Carthage. He reportedly killed a barbarian king in single combat, which is pretty metal. He was an Equestrian Class guy. He was a tough guy. He was not into Greek culture. He was a Roman for Romans sort of people. He would hang out with the generals. And when he was tribune, he changed the law so that soldiers didn't have to own land. Now soldiers were loyal to generals instead of the states, and they fought ambitiously to gain land rather than to defend it. The new armies never went home, which means they were much, much better because they trained together all the time. And that made them awesome. That made them very good at their jobs because, they don't go home. All right. Okay. So the Cimbri and the Teutons were some Germanic tribes that came through and did their best to conquer Rome, and this guy Gaius Marius defended Rome against them. Historians who talk about race, like Tacitus, talk about how wild and crazy and tough these guys were. One thing we do know from the from the Roman sources is that they really were scared of these guys. They were some pretty terrifying people, which makes sense. They often fought naked and covered in paint, and they had crazy dreadlocks and big beards, and they were huge people. They were really big. They were on average like maybe up to 10 centimeters taller than Romans on average. Just big, big people. And Hitler, when he's talking about the German people and what a great warrior race they are, digs up some of this stuff. Hitler's my favorite. So Gaius Marius defeated the barbarian hordes. Rome made him consul for decades, even though he wasn't in Rome, and even though a consul is supposed to be a consul for a very short period of time. So he defeated 300,000 barbarians, the Cimbri and the Teutons, and the Ambrones, who were Gauls. Gauls are from France, what is now France. He came home to try to be a politician, and he failed. Now, this idea you're welcome to write about, because this is awesome. This is about the torch of history. It talks about how during this period in Rome, this is obviously too small, but you can see that we just don't know anything about all these places in the world. And we have these very limited histories from places in Eurasia, and we have a little bit over here in Mexico from the very developed tribal architecture that we find over here. And it's just very interesting that while Rome was kicking off, there are so few other places in the world where we know anything. There was just nothing going on. And Dan Carlin, my boy, starts to talk about the torch of history and the kind of how these tribes of Europe are being shown to us for the first time through the Roman sources who are fighting against them. They have a lot of good things to say about them, but they, of course, have a lot of bad things to say about them, too. Okay, so Gaius Gracchus was the younger brother, and like I said about these guys, you're welcome to check them out. But one quote from him was interesting. He said that he was creating daggers with which the nobles might lacerate each other. And the things that he was doing was empowering the middle class and creating middle class senators, doing things like that, in even talking about extending citizenship to people who were not Italians. There were two kinds of political parties back then. There were the Populare and the Optimates. And the Optimates, that was a mean word that was thrown at them. And it was kind of like, I don't want to say red shirts and yellow shirts, but it was like, because I don't know what that means. I can't read any of the Thai sources. The Populare were like trying to become popular with the common people and trying to feed people who were starving, do things like that. And then the Optimates were saying, if you are indeed an excellent person, you are born into a quote-unquote good family, and you have everything going for you, there's no reason why you should be held back from your highest ambitions, and you should do everything that you can to succeed, and the government shouldn't hold those people back. The way that they fought against this, Gaius Gracchus, was very interesting. They got another tribune named Marcus Livius Drusus, and whatever Gaius Gracchus proposed, whatever he said, let's do that, let's give bread to the people, this guy would propose more. He'd say, let's give 2 loaves of bread to everybody. And everyone's like, damn, wow. So he proposed too much. The thing that was interesting, though, was the Senate supported Marcus Livius Drusus. And they were giving away so much money just to reduce the power of this Gaius Gracchus. So this is like counter-demagoguery. Here, I'm blowing up. This is like counter-demagoguery. Gaius ended up having to quit, and once he quit, everybody in the Senate undid his reforms. So that was the technique that the Senate would use in order to undermine his demagoguery, if you call it that, or his fighting for the people, if you call it that. But what this guy was doing was straight up demagoguery, and it was supported by the Senate. Years later, after you could see what's happening, Gaius returned. He tried to get into the Senate, and he ended up getting murdered. A lot of people ended up getting murdered who were fighting with him. In the aftermath, there were 3,000 citizens dead. No one was allowed to mourn. And it was all based on political goals and personal ambitions. Don't mess with the Senate. Caius Marius also suffered the same fate. In comparison, the Soviet Union ground up Hitler and denied him a final resting place. They threw him in a river so that no Nazis could gather and find the body of Hitler. One quote that I think is really amazing is from JFK. Those who make peaceful progress impossible make violent process inevitable. So you could just get a sense of how violent it was in Rome. The class divisions were pretty serious. The senators were landowners. The equestrians were doing business. The working poor were working and being poor. The soldiers, other Italians, non-Roman citizens, and slaves all had stakes in this too. The senators already had a lot of power, but these guys would show up and they would challenge the power of the senators. And one of the ways they'd do this is by trying to give the equestrians more power. And they could kind of create a mob out of the working poor. Caius Marius was one of the people who worked with the soldiers, trying to make the soldiers have a good situation, help their situation out. And when he did that, he supported, of course, his own soldiers, and then he had an army. And when you have an army, you just do what you need to do with an army. Other Italians, non-Roman citizens, a lot of people talked about giving them citizenship, but I don't personally remember who actually did give them citizenship. But after maybe 200 AD it is, I am just talking here. I don't know if that's true. You need to look that up. Non-Roman citizens started to have statehood. They started to be Romans. All the way up in England, you'd be a Roman. And down in Egypt, you would be a Roman. So the empire stopped being a republic, and it started being a little bit more inclusive with its citizenship. This is just a comparison. Here's a picture of Rome. I'm going to pause for a moment here for station identification. So here we go. The first triumvirate was Julius Caesar, Marcus Crassus, and Pompey the Great. Pompey was another general, and Marcus Crassus was the bank. He was the richest man in Rome. Pompey the Great was busy putting down a slave rebellion led by the gladiator Spartacus. He was a Thracian warrior who was taken to be a slave, became a gladiator champion, and then led a slave rebellion. This is from the TV show, which is insanely graphic. You're welcome to watch that, but it is insanely graphic. Who was the most famous Roman ever? That would obviously be Julius Caesar. His name is still apparent in words like Tsar or Kaiser. They both mean Caesar. He ended up, that word Caesar ended up in the Bible a lot. Render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, and render unto God what is God's. Which is kind of the way that Christians will step out of politics. They will say, let the ruling government people do what they do, and you just concern yourself with your spiritual life. And this is not true of all religious doctrines, especially not throughout history. But Christians take that more or less seriously. There's a sect in the United States called the Jehovah's Witnesses who will not vote because they think it is worldly, and they take that piece of scripture as their cornerstone of that idea. Don't vote. Render unto Caesar what is Caesar's. Render unto God what is God's. That's the interpretation of it. It's in the Bible. It's the Word of God. But it would make sense, of course, that what is God's would be everything. But it's kind of instructive to Christians to tell them, mind your own business. So he was a priest of Jupiter. He was also a soldier. He was also a lawyer. He was taken hostage by pirates. And then he killed them. He became tribune. He became Pontifex Maximus, which is the great priest. He's the head priest of Jupiter. And Jupiter was like Zeus, the head god. He was propraetor governor of Hispania, which is Spain. Propraetor is, he was a praetor, which is like a governor, and pro means that his term was extended because he was at war. And he was at war all the time. He was pacifying Gaul. Gaul is what we now know as France. He used a divide and conquer strategy because the tribes were not unified, and not even within the tribes were they unified. Now, armies can get bigger. If you have millions of people in Gaul, you can bring them all together, but the Romans would just build walls and fortify themselves because the Romans had government, they had organization, and they would use those things to fight against their enemies. Julius Caesar was very good at this, and before he was, a legend, when he was just making his name, when he was in his 30s, he was up there going back and forth from Rome, but up there using tribesmen against one another and killing a lot of people, taking them as slaves, becoming fantastically rich and immensely powerful, and getting a lot of experience killing people. Woe to the vanquished is something, it's an idea that when somebody gets conquered, you can have a peace treaty, but if the person who is winning starts to change the rules. It's a quote from an ancient general who said, "Woe to the vanquished," which means you lose, so we're going to do whatever we want. There's a little bit of law in war, but not much. The bridge here was the story about how they were going to cross a river over into Germany. And rather than cross it with boats, they built a whole bridge with cranes and everything for many days. They went across the bridge, killed some people, came back, destroyed the bridge, just to kind of say, hey, we can do this anytime. Caesar went all the way to England, and it was kind of obvious that he was here to stay. So there's this theory that Caesar caught the Gauls at a strange time. They were so close to Rome that they were receiving Roman culture, so they were not straight up barbarians. They were not these crazy animalistic people who would just fight with no regard for their life, because they were getting a little bit of Roman culture. So this idea that appears in many history books is that these barbarians were starting to turn their ship around. And if they would have gotten all the way back around, they would have been safe from flipping over. But Caesar felt like he caught them in this moment where they had the drink, and they had the love of fanciness, and the love of just being happy and enjoying the cultural things. But they were not here yet. They didn't have the crazy organization that Romans had. Because like we said, Romans are like 50% soldier, 50% construction worker. And here in the ancient past, they were just death machines, and you didn't want to mess with them. And so Caesar always talks about how here in France, they are kind of somewhere in the middle. But if you head up to Germany, they're still really that crazy, full-on barbarian type. Okay. Vercingetorix, I'm going to go through this quickly. Vercingetorix was a king who tried to unify the Gauls against Caesar because he could see that everything was going to hell. The Druids were like priests, and the tribes didn't all have a common culture, and they didn't have all a common language, but they all had Druids. The Druids would speak to each other, and they brought everybody together and started to form a web and get people together. Here, this is Stonehenge up in England, and this is one of the places where they think Druidic worship was going on. So Vercingetorix said, obviously there was no American flag. He told everybody to burn their last few cities, and they did. And it was because he wanted to start to be a little bit more organized. Not this organized, of course, but pretty organized, right? So he said, the Romans are coming to kill us. Let's burn their cities, because otherwise the Romans are going to have clear targets to go for, and it's going to be very easy for them. They're very good at taking cities. They've been doing it for a really long time. Our cities are not that well defended. So there were 3 cities that were still standing, and they remained unburned. And this is usually automated and says not for long, because of course the Romans are awesome at taking cities they ran in, and they ransacked these cities. Around the last city, because they have things like artillery, they have these things that'll actually like fling rocks and decimate the city. A Roman centurion, like I said, is like also a building machine. They fight in a very organized way. And around the very last city, they were able to build this crazy fort with lots of booby traps and spikes and fortifications. They built a city around the city that was almost as fortified as the Gallic city. The place was called Alatia, and you can see that this is the Roman walls. They built an inner wall, and they heard that Vercingetorix had called out to all of the people out here in Gaul, and they were all going to ride in and smash the Roman army that was waiting around Alatia. So they built another wall. And this is in like a month. They're crazy. It's like Cimbri when there was a flood. Okay, so of course Caesar ends up winning, and this is a great painting of Vercingetorix surrendering. Okay. So Caesar was proconsul, he crossed the Rubicon with his army, which basically means after he was done in Gaul, they said, hey, you, come home. We don't approve of what you're doing. And he goes, oh, yeah, I'll come home. He came home and he pursued Pompey, who was part of the triumvirate, who was his buddy. He pursued him to his death in Egypt. He made Cleopatra king when he met her because she was pretty darn cool. She was the last ruler from the line of Ptolemy. Ptolemy was one of Alexander the Great's generals when his army split up. So she is a descendant of the Greeks. She was a diplomat, a naval commander, a medical author. She had Caesar's son named Caesarion. So some main points about him was that he became imperator, dictator for life, and he was murdered by the Senate. Octavian took on the name Augustus. He made power hereditary, and he made the emperor a god. So Rome was no longer a republic because the leader was not being voted for. The leader was just whoever was a relative of the person who had led before, who was a relative of Caesar. So the emperor was now a god. Is this good for Christians? One of their commandments specifically says, thou shalt have no other gods before me. Now, Buddhism is not quite this jealous. Hinduism, obviously, is not, and the gods will proclaim that they are the greatest, but the monotheism of Abrahamic religions is very monotheistic. They believe in one God, and they believe that everything else is pretend. Taoism is another system where you can be a Taoist and a Christian at the same time, and the Tao doesn't care because it is a path. So Christians didn't have a fun time. They were getting eaten by lions all the time, and they, because they were supposed to treat the emperor like a god, they were supposed to light an incense stick. And the Romans are cool, and the Romans would try to be tolerant and say, hey, why don't you just light a stick of incense? And they're like, no, thou shalt have no gods before me. That would be like worship. So the Christians were very proud of their faith. Early Christians were super hardcore. Early Christian churches were like somebody's house. But Christianity, here's the gladiatory arena, of course, the famous Colosseum. No. And this is the Pantheon. Marcus Aurelius, like I said about the Christians were very hardcore, and they were like an underground movement. They were definitely not a majority. It took a long time for Christianity to catch on in Rome. But when it did, it did. Marcus Aurelius was one of the best emperors of all time. You can get Stoic quotes on your phone. I should look mine up right now and see what it says. This is really cool. It is not he who reviles or strikes you who insults you, but your opinion that these things are insulting. So it's not true that somebody who is insulting you is insulting you. You're insulting yourself by believing this person.
It is not he who reviles or strikes you who insults you, but your opinion that these things are...
Paul out. Okay. So Marcus Aurelius is amazing. Some of the quotes I have actually prepared from his meditations are, the more we value things outside our control, the less control we have. And the soul becomes dyed with the color of its thoughts, which sounds very Buddhist to me. Emperor Constantine converted to Christianity. He changed the capital to Constantinople. The Council of Nicaea argued over many of the finer points of Christianity and split the church into an east and west. There you have it. The Eastern Roman Empire remained alive, and the Western Roman Empire famously fell. The first schism was between who? Then you see these cultural schisms happening throughout the world. Look at the light blue and the dark blue. The light blue stems from the Eastern Roman Empire, and the dark blue stems from the Western Roman Empire. The Visigoths were the tribe that eventually took Rome. Now, here we go. We're fond of calling barbarians barbarians. The Mongol horde was one of the greatest empires of all time. And the Roman Empire was not even on the list of top 10, if you recall that video I sent you. Here's a famous painting of the Visigoths. They spared the churches when they came to sack Rome because the Visigoths were Christian. And this was in the year 410 AD. Alaric was the head of this barbarian horde of Christian Germans who sacked Rome. Okay. So what did they do well? They were good at government. They were very good at absorbing and tolerating other cultures. They had a meritocracy for sure for a long time, and they had a lot of social mobility. People could move up. What were the structural pillars of the Roman state? The Roman military, of course. The infrastructure, which means roads, bridges, aqueducts. Paris and Chicago were worse 100 years ago. The government was excellent. Roman law was applied to all people equally, supposedly. And finally, the Catholic Church. Now, the last pillar of Rome was the Catholic Church, which could not really be sacked because even the barbarians at this point were Christians. And the Roman Empire fell, but the Roman Empire fell, but the continuation of the Roman Empire was with the Roman Catholicism. People will today call themselves Roman Catholic, and it's because Catholicism was born in Rome, and the Pope became the pontiff of an empire of the soul. Western civilization was held together by the church, and Islam ended up having its explosion. Sometimes we have an expert come in and teach Islam. It would be a good time to go on a YouTube hole and learn all you can about Islam. And in ancient times, they were great scientists and philosophers. Dope. I'm going to make this a couple of videos because I have to go home and pick up my baby. I hope you enjoyed and look forward to the next.